This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Act
is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center. Writer and filmmaker Dream Hampton has been one of the great Renaissance voices of the hip-hop generation. Today she joins us for an extended conversation from Detroit, talking about her life, her career, and of course her collaboration with Sean Carter. And later we're joined by Professor Elaine Richardson, who talks about how she's gone from a poor hoe on dope to a PhD, where she is one of the most recognizable experts on literacy in the world. I'm Anthony Neal, and this is Left to Black. Good afternoon and welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Anthony Neal, and we are joined this afternoon, and this has been almost 2 years in the making, with Miss Dream Hampton, who is coming to us from Detroit, a pioneer of hip-hop journalism, former editor at The Source, a longtime contributor to Vibe magazine from its launch, a product of New York University's Tisch School of the Art. Hampton's films include I Am Ali, 2002, and the Black August Hip Hop Project from 2010. Chosen by the online magazine For Harriet as one of the most inspiring Black women on Twitter, Hampton recently directed the video Queens for The Satisfaction. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, and I'm sorry it took so long. I had legitimate excuses, right? Like, my excuses are like epic. Like, I have to run to Russia.
No, it's all
right back.
It's all good. It's all good. And so I was sitting down having coffee with our friend Joan Morgan a few days ago.
I love Joan.
And of course, you know, I'm trying to work through this geeky Stan moment with you.
I'm sure Joan helped you through it.
And so Joan and I literally asked her, well, you know, what kind of questions should I ask Dream, right? Because, you know, part of this and why have always been so interested in having you on Left to Black is like, I mean, you have done so many amazing things, continue to do so many amazing things. So I really did want to start with this writing piece. I read an interview that you did with Michael Tillery, and you made this point, I'm not one of those people who writes because I can't write. And I'm one of those folks who write because I can't not write. I have to write every day.
So you're a real writer. You're what I call a real writer.
And so talk a little bit about your process. You know, what are the things that move you to write? And particularly given the kind of struggles that all of us have with writing and the fact that there are so many people out there who write almost just for the sake of writing without actually thinking about things like craft and style and all those kinds of things that make great writers great writers.
Well, first, I really care about craft and style. Like those, as a reader, which I consider myself a world-class reader, and I am an okay writer, but being such a reader, a voracious reader, and having been one my entire life, I got that from my mother and my grandmother. My daughter also is a huge reader. I really read text closely, whether I'm reading critical writing, critical theory, whether I'm reading nonfiction, whether I'm reading fiction. I have always been a very close reader of text. And in terms of my writing process, it kind of is how it began. And it began when I was a teenager at The Source, and something came into the office that no one else knew how to handle or what to do with, and that was Dee Barnes being brutalized by Dr. Dre. Yeah. And if I had not written about it, no one would have. So it's that Martin Luther King piece about, you know, it's kind of like about the necessity. It's like, if not you, then who? But now there are all these other people who are writing, and I'd like to, like, you know, step aside and let them do the hip hop thing. I don't think that I write about hip hop too often. Yeah. I ended up saying something to Chris Brown that his mother got BET to take down, and it was basically that he needed therapy. But when I wrote that, I felt like I was dipping into younger writers' territory. Like, I really feel like they should have that space and be having those conversations. I don't feel conflicted about hip hop like I once did. partly because I'm not the big fan that I once was. um, but yeah, I don't get up and journal. I don't. I read all the time. I read the links that people send out on Twitter. I read the 5 or 6 books that are always in bed with me or near my bed, but I don't get up and journal. And what motivates me to write is a deadline. I hate to say that, but it's true. I'm on 12 different deadlines this very second. Um, I'm like Dorothy Parker. You've seen me tweet that before. Like,
Yeah,
I hate writing. I love having written. Like, when
yeah,
it's done and it's all shiny and somewhere, I'm like, hey, look what I wrote. But the writing itself is torture for me. And if it's not for other people, it flows. I certainly sit down and it pours out. I spend a lot of time thinking about what I'm going to write, which a lot of people call procrastination. But I really do believe that that is a part of my process. And living is a part of my process. I really believe in occupying my life. And that's a huge part of the process for me of writing. But I'm not as prolific as some people. Teray, for instance, is far more prolific than me. Someone like Lola Ogunaki, like, they write far more frequently than I do. So I just try to make what I do write count. One of my best friends, I wouldn't call him a mentor, but is Greg Tate. If you compare his output to someone like Nelson George's, it's not even in the same league. Nelson has written 12 books, and Tate may or may not ever finish this great American novel. He has a collection of essays. He's working on a James Brown book. But what he does put out, to me, just bodies most of his peers.
absolutely. I think, Greg writes basically, an introduction to a new book with every one of his Facebook updates.
Right. His longest Facebook. I dragged him onto Facebook, and sometimes I regret it. I'm like, yo, son, it's one thing when you have to do a longer tweet. I get annoyed when people do those. My tweet was too long, so here's the longer tweet. But my God, you have like 900 words on Facebook, and Tate still needs a part 2.
We're here with Dream Hampton, who's coming to us from Detroit. You mentioned about what it's like writing these days, and talk a little bit about the shift from when you got started, back into Source, and where writing is now. There seems as though there are far too many writers now, and far too many people with opinions now. But in terms of the output of what we're looking at, has there been something lost over these last 20 years?
I mean, I'm not one to bemoan any era that I'm in. I mean, I'm certain that Norman Mailer was reading The Voice when I began writing there in 1990 or 91 and saying, this isn't the voice of the 70s. And he's right, it wasn't the voice of the 70s. It was a village voice that Greg Tate and myself and Joan Morgan and Scott Polson Bryant and all these other writers were writing in its pages. So it's too easy to say writing isn't what it was. Of course it's not. At the same time, writing is a pretty near ancient tradition. And, there are basic kind of tenets to it. We're trying to communicate something, and we're trying to do that as clearly as possible, even when we're dense, like whomever, whether you're talking about Toni Morrison or James Thurber's not so dense, but whoever you're talking about, like in terms of density, there's still like a kind of a precision involved in that. And I would hate to see that part of writing lost. I see a lot of, it's kind of what I see happening to writing in terms of blogging, which I think is what you're kind of getting at, is the same thing that happened to poetry with spoken word. So you have these people who, whether or not they know it, they're channeling like the Sonia Sanchez, Nikki Giovanni kind of cadence. But Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez can stand up on the page. So there was a conversational tone that a lot of this magazine writing and even memoir writing, I mean, obviously that exploded in the 90s. That the conversational tone of memoir writing, of magazine writing, became even more conversational in blogs. And sometimes what's lost in that is basic skill. And I don't believe in necessarily taking writing classes. I know that Teray took that journalism course at Columbia, and other people I know have taken different writing classes. I really believe in reading. Like when I began writing for magazines, I was there at the source as the photo editor. I'm someone who primarily thinks in images, and I still do that. I privilege images over written text even, in my own personal life. And what even the writers that I like are incredibly visual writers. And when I think of that time, I went back and I read Gay Talese from Esquire in the 50s and 60s. I went back and read Norman Mailer. I mean, I went back and got those Norton anthologies of the best magazine writing of whatever. Went back and really closely read Joan Didion. And I, I read Greg Tate in The Voice, and I read Harry Allen, and I just read all these writers who mattered. And I didn't necessarily mimic them, but I was like, oh, these are the rules. Like, this is how this is done. If I'm going to do it differently, that's fine. But I went and studied great magazine writing. And there are great blogs out there. If you want to be a blogger, you should read Ta-Nehisi. If you should read Byron Crawford.
Right.
There are people out there to read closely. So there's not a lot of what passes as journalism now. Being someone who's been interviewed recently, like kind of not a lot, but more than I'd like to be interviewed. There is a real laziness, down to like emailing the questions. Like people aren't interested in what happens in conversation.
Right.
It seems like they're trying to get around transcribing. And trust me, I hate transcribing too, but email questions is just not the same. You have people who don't do any research beyond Wiki, which is sad to me because we're in an era right now where information is more accessible than it's ever been.
Right.
So I'm embarrassed for a lot of the people who call themselves journalists. And some of the people who've interviewed me, I've had to, in the interview, direct them to things that they could have easily found spending 7 minutes on Google. And I don't have a lot of tolerance for that. I don't think that it's acceptable. I myself don't do it even when I'm tweeting. So I don't understand how people who are approaching you for an interview do it.
You mentioned, that you think in a visual sense, that's the primary way you kind of see the world. Talk about what it's like going back and forth between the writer instinct in you and film narrative. Whether it's something like a documentary or something like I Am Ali. Talk about what that process is like for you.
Well, I mean, each project is its own project. I wish that there were more projects. Writing is something that you finally sit down and do. Kate says they write with your ass. Like you have to sit down and finally do it, right? Film is collaborative. It's like calling a war. It's like calling together a quick battle. Like you have to gather your troops. Finance is a huge part of it, even as, film becomes more democratized with some of the digital stuff that's happening with cameras. So, I wish that I had as many films out as I do in my head. But each project was different. I Am Ali, I was dealing with two different men in my life who had done very quick spirals into schizophrenia. And when I began researching it, I learned that schizophrenia is a pretty rapidly degenerative disorder, and you kind of go from being someone to someone pretty unrecognizable in a matter of weeks. And I literally witnessed that in my own life. And so I began thinking about it. I began thinking about the people that I knew both had heard auditory commands, meaning one of them was arrested on Grand Concourse in his boxers in February, which is kind of literally a scene out of I Am Ali. But he tried to rob a woman. He told her that Jesus said her Honda was his. And so he ended up on Rikers for grand larceny because, of course, Giuliani had shut down all of the mental health institutions that would have supported him as opposed to criminalizing his behavior.
Right.
But what was interesting to me was that he, like so many people hear auditory commands, always hear them from like Jesus or Buddha, or like it's never their landlord or their uncle. And I was like, well, who would be that for us? And for me, I was like, well, of course, Muhammad Ali. At the time, I was writing it for Q-Tip to play in it, and Will Smith was shooting Ali,
right.
And Tip had a better Muhammad Ali accent than Will Smith to me. He really got the Kentucky part. So I was writing it for Will I mean, for Tip, and he ended up not doing it. Ishmael did, from Diggable Planets, longtime friend and partner of mine. Um, and he just nailed it for me. And it was about him kind of unraveling and thinking that he was Muhammad Ali. So that's how that came about. Black August, came about because I had been a member of Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, a human rights organization, and we'd been organizing around political prisoners, U.S. political prisoners, a specific group of U.S. political prisoners for 10 years. And we had been trying to raise awareness and funds for them. And we've been doing these concerts, the Black August concert series. So that documentary is part concert series with Mos Def and Talib Kweli and Zed Prez and David Banner and Fat Joe and all of the people who had done the show for us, and these trips that we took as cultural exchanges to Cuba and South Africa. And people had just been shooting those entire 10 years, and I had too. And when we went to Cuba, of course, we would do political education sessions with the artists and the people who came with us, with Asada. And she would talk to them about what a political prisoner was, what her own personal journey was. Most people that go on these trips with us have read her book. So I had all this stuff on camera, and that was about sitting in a room for almost 3 years and editing it. And then, I just shot that music video. Was my very first ever music video, and that's a whole nother process.
Talk about how that came about. It was interesting because, you started sending out little feelers about, you did this music video. And it's an artist that wasn't necessarily on everybody's radar. Of course, it's a great album once folks had a chance to listen to it.
Yeah.
Talk about being brought into that process and how music video represents yet another and different kind of medium for you to talk about these kind of narrative issues.
Again, I had opportunities back in the 90s when hip hop videos were like $250,000.
Yeah.
Puff knew I was at NYU. Biggie knew I was at NYU. He was my good friend and my neighbor. He asked me to direct One More Chance. And I was like, no. I was like, I'm an auteur. I only do cinema. Like, what a dummy I was. But so here I get into it, 20 years later or whatever, when the budgets are $3,000. My friend, John Moore, he manages These Satisfaction and Shabazz Palaces. Like I said, I've had a long relationship with Shabazz Palaces. I'm sure you've seen me tweet about their music, and my friend Khalil Joseph did an outstanding, just killer video for them, for Bellhaven Meridian. So These Satisfaction came on my radar as artists who were collaborating with Shabazz Palaces. They do vocal performances on Black Up. You know me, I'm always putting people on to new music. I've been doing that my whole life, I remember telling Puff, yo, Maddie has this amazing demo that you need to call him about. And it was Biggie. Like, I'm into, putting people on to new music. So These Satisfaction was someone I had been tweeting about because their music is awesome. John was like, do you want to do the video? I was on the air on a radio show in Seattle, and I was like, yeah. So we kind of said, she's doing the video. And when I put myself out there like that, it kind of is like, okay, well, now I'm going to do it. I'm very much a doer, and I believe in being a doer. So I wrote this treatment. I put the treatment online. I recently put it on my Tumblr, and hopefully it reads pretty much like what I shot. I just we didn't have a lot of money, so I was going with the whole Breakfast Club theme of 1 or 2 rooms. And I've been looking at Micheline Thomas's work, who I've been, tweeting about for the past 2 years. I'm very excited by the work that's happening in terms of visual arts and Black women, whether it's Deanna Lawson or Wangechi Mutu or the continual work of Carrie Mae Weems or Lorna Simpson. But so Micheline was the inspiration for this video. I wrote it in the treatment, and I wanted to have a video where women were primping and preening, it looked like they were going to go out, and I really wanted the getting ready to be about women taking care of one another. In fact, in the treatment, I wrote that each woman is each other's lady in waiting. So it was really about kind of helping, which I've experienced. I've had my girlfriends do my hair, and back when I used to get my hair done, and help with the nails and that whole situation where women are just helping each other get ready. But in the end, they're like, yo, the party is right here. This is the party. So that was the treatment, and we just shot it. I had some hiccups going into production. I lost my DP 2 days before we began shooting. We were supposed to shoot on a Red, but we ended up shooting on the Canon 5 and 7. But the actual shoot itself was magical. I mean, it was the women just showed up. I spent a lot of money. I spent of that. Well, I ended up spending some. I paid to direct that, so I spent a lot of money feeding them. Like we had lobster mac and cheese and like just really good food. So that because I knew if I had 20 women there, I didn't want them any of them to leave because it was like a whack set. And I treated them like queens, which is the name of the song. And the crew, like we had all these women. I had 3 guys on set. But there were all these women like on the set working, the stylist, the set designer. Everyone was just amazing, and it was a magical day. So hopefully some of that comes across in the video.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined this afternoon by Dream Hampton, who is talking with us about her trajectory of her career and a range of other things. I'm looking at the album cover, Yusef Lateef, in the corner of your office.
Yes.
And so talk about Detroit, talk about growing up in Detroit, talk about after being all these other places, why you decide to come back to Detroit to settle, to do what you do.
Yeah. Well, I'm from the D. I'm from the east side of Detroit. I'm from one of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. Historically, it was called the Black Bottom. Mm-hmm. Detroit, of course, is home to like the largest, for decades, the largest Black middle class, Black middle income. I really don't believe in a middle class necessarily. It's not very transferable when it comes to us. But Black middle income, homeowners who for decades had owned their homes. A couple of, very important things happened. Reagan began union busting with the pilots. Clinton effectively, moved industry outside of America. And, crack came into our communities. And it was this and I should also take some responsibility. And then there was like vast corruption within our own city government. So all these things kind of conspired and colluded to create almost a post-capital capitalist city. I mean, we talk about ourselves as post-manufacturing and post this and that, but when I came home to visit before I moved back, I was seeing all of this kind of shared cooperative living. I was seeing urban farming. I was seeing artists who were really, there are people here who pay each other. I forgot what it's called, but it's kind of like a credit. So like if you don't have money, you pay someone with, there are these restaurants that'll do credits. My girlfriend DJ'd a party and she got $300 in restaurant credits. Wow. So, I mean, there's like some really interesting things happening in Detroit. We got to show the world that during the U.S. Social Forum in 2010 with Another Detroit is Happening. And at that point, I had been home for a year. Some of it is personal. I mean, I came home after being in New York for 18 years because New York burns you out, yeah. And my daughter felt burnt out by it. She wanted to go to school here. She's in a really great school here. It's a suburban school. It's not public. But she wanted to stay here. My mother, who'd been married for, more than 35 years, had lost my dad, and she wasn't doing so well. So it was all of those things that made me decide to move home. And I'm so happy I have. Like, the hip hop scene is just exploding, and it has been like my whole life. I always thought, like, why don't we have any great MCs from Detroit? And I mean, I know why. It's because we always had the shadow economy and industry of crack. And there was always a lot more money to be made. Yeah. And there was having a music deal. But when I came home, some of my favorite hip hop was happening right here in Detroit, from Ms. Corona and Invincible and Ms. Jones and Marv Won and Black Milk and even Big Sean. That hit that he has, Ass, is such a Detroit song. Like, there's a whole like kind of really strong fast beat that comes out of techno that Derek May and Kevin Saunderson and Juan Atkins and all those put down. Right. So, I mean, I just come from like a really rich city. I mean, there's Motown. I could go on about the jazz people, the jazz legends,
Hard
Betty
bop,
Parker.
Yeah. All those folks that came out of Cass Tech.
Yes, and I went to Cass Tech. Yes, Betty Carter went to Cass Tech. Ron Carter went to Cass Tech. Lily Tomlin and John DeLorean. So, yes, it's a beautiful city. And I'm just really inspired by everything that's happening here. We're imagining new ways to be in community, new ways to live, and new ways to be. And I'm excited about that,
Talk a little about, you're one of these folks who made a fairly seamless transition into the Twitter world. And it's always useful to do that when you already have a certain kind of celebrity outside of the Twitter world and substance with that celebrity, and then to come into this kind of Twitter space. But one of the things I've often appreciated about your presence on Twitter is that you do a form of public mommying. You talk a great deal about the parenting process in ways that are very productive, and I imagine also helpful for those folks who follow you on Twitter.
Well, I hope so. I feel like I do a lot of bragging. I really my friends are always like teasing me. They're like, I can't believe you got your daughter because she's like so sweet. I was complaining, I took her to London recently for her sweet 16, and she wore her headphones almost the entire trip. And I came home and I was complaining about that. And my girlfriend was like, well, my 13-year-old stepdaughter tried to spend the night at a 22-year-old's house. So I was like, okay, I'll stop complaining. My family is very small. It's my daughter and I, in terms of my so-called nuclear family, my immediate family. And so it can be, claustrophobic, and it can be challenging. And maybe I don't tweet about that enough, but mostly it has been like one of the most amazing things to happen to me. And I mean that beyond the cliche. Like, she's transformed me. She really was this person who came here to teach me all of these lessons, primarily around patience, but also she came here very intact. She came here with her super, just sensitivity, a real moral compass, and she has taught me how to listen and just how to be a better person. So, I don't mind tweeting about that. She gets annoyed by it. She thinks that people expect her to be awesome, because I always call her the awesome daughter because I'm trying to not say her name all the time. And she's like, people are going to meet me and expect me to be awesome. And I'm like, but you are. Twitter is interesting. I think that the most, interesting or annoying thing about me is that I'm always threatening to leave. I have all these I know I'm not the only one though. So people can't that I don't own that as being the sole person, but it's a great space. I love it when people are talking about what they're thinking about as opposed to what they're doing. Yeah. Unless what they're doing is being at the Manning Marable conference or something amazing. But it's also, it's a space where people make demands on you. Like, sometimes when I'm trying to log off, there'll be 30 more questions. Some of them are Googleable, which maybe I can, be responsible for coining that phrase. But some of them, some of them are people just really wanting to engage you, and I appreciate that. I mean, sometimes being in Detroit, coming from somewhere like New York, it can be lonely. A lot of my friends are still in New York, and I travel to New York and LA often to work. So I think for all of us, Twitter tends to be this place where we go when if we're not lonely, we feel bored. So we're like, let me check and see what everyone else is doing. I like Twitter most when, like I said, people are talking about what they're thinking about, when I'm getting links and facts and opinions, and I just love that. And I guess I do participate at a pretty high level. But then I take breaks. I'm on a break right now, and I'll disappear for 20 days because, I have to be restorative with my own thinking. I have to protect my thoughts and not always be taking in other people's thoughts. So that's important for me too, to kind of protect my mind.
You're watching Left of Black. We're joined this afternoon by Dream Hampton. And Dream, I'm going to ask you the inevitable question. Okay. The question that you've probably been asked 1,000 and 1,500 times over the last year and a half. So talk about what it's like, or what it was like collaborating with Mr. Carter.
Oh, okay. I didn't know
on First to Black, but the unpublished Black book, but then Decoded. What was different about working on those two very different projects?
Well, let me see. Jay and I are friends, and I think that has a lot to do with his willingness to open up to me. He's very paranoid. He hasn't hustled in a very long time, but he still has that drug dealer paranoia, which I kind of grew up with. I mean, people think that the police or the feds are Law and Order, tracking all these clues, but really what they do is get people in rooms and get them to tell. Right. So I grew up with a lot of paranoid people, particularly men. So Jay, he was someone for years that, I respected his privacy, and we talked a lot about ideas, and he felt understood, he said, by me. I felt understood by him, certainly. and our friendship was just one, before texting, and we would like literally just sit on the phone for hours just talking about stuff, about the music industry, about drugs, about codes, about intergender relationships, about hypercapitalism, about his own addiction to money, as he talks about it in his music. And we'd have arguments. I remember calling all his phones, including the studio when he when he did Super Ugly, when he talked about Carmen, Nas's baby's mom.
Yeah.
And we've had arguments over the B word and over, his gender analysis. So he's just one of those friends in my life, like Greg Tate, who I bounce ideas off of and who I'm receptive to his. And so part of that, I say all that to say that Decoded is an extension of that and a continuance of that conversation. The Black Book was something different. It was far more, not confessional, but his own story and his unpacking his story. And I respect him not putting that out. Oprah did the same thing. She is someone who, I don't watch her show or didn't watch it, and I knew that she had a coke problem, that she had abortions, that she's a victim of sexual, some trauma.
Right.
And I knew that because she had unpacked it verbally. But when she had her writer sit down and wrote this autobiography, she ended up shelving it and putting it in a vault, just like Jay did with the Black Book. And it has to do with people's idea of text being sacred. And because, again, Jay, with even the Black Album, a lot of the Black Book informs the Black Album.
Yeah.
So, and there are like things that predate that on the Blueprint. He's talked about shooting his brother in the shoulder. He's talked about drug abuse in his own family and his father's, he's really talked about his father abandoning him.
Right.
A lot of music. But I think that there was something, and I could get deep on you. I think it's about us privileging the written text over oral performances and that being a Western idea. And so that it becomes more precious and more real when it's written down. And I don't necessarily believe that. And I had those same issues when it came time to write Decoded. We'll collaborate with him on writing it. It was very much a collaborative effort. It was him, myself, and Chris Jackson at Spiegel and Grau, the editor, who did a lot more than edit on this book. He really was super involved in this book. But so, at the same time, we were all looking at that, like, just because Jay is like writing, and people think from the title that it's just gonna be him breaking down lyrics, and his lyrics, they're not didactic, but they're not Ghostface. Like, they don't need, decoded in that way. And really, we were talking about the codes of a whole generation. Yeah. But I say all that to say, as with this issue of privileging the written text when it came to Black Book, and that being the thing that kept he and Oprah from releasing their autobiographies, I didn't want, when we wrote Decoded, for that text to be more important than all of this music. And I saw that happen with Motown, with these Motown reviews. Like, it's become a museum now. Like, it's not alive. That kind of soul music isn't alive anymore. It's just something that we review. And it's unfortunate that hip hop may be headed in that direction, where the books become more interesting than the music that's being produced. I felt that was happening back when Allen Iverson joined the NBA. I was like, wow, the more interesting things about hip hop are happening outside of
hip hop. Yeah.
But so, that's what it was. It was just a long conversation with both of them. With the Black Book, I went on tour with him. He was doing a tour with 50 Cent, and I was just on tour with him. With this book, he was at home, so I came to New York, and I would just go to he and his wife's home every day, and we would talk and record stuff. There were times when we may have done it at a restaurant, but for the most part, we just went to his home. He has a huge, super big couch. and it just worked. We had this, all of his lyrics printed out, and we would just kind of go through them. I used Twitter. I asked people on Twitter what were their favorite Jay-Z lyrics, and we examined some of those lyrics, and, So that's what the process was like. Then, it came out. I was blown away by the art, that Chris Jackson
absolutely
body, the way that the book looks. So I'm really proud in that way. The cover, the Andy Warhol Rorschach, was just Jay making a phone call to the Warhol estate. And then the campaign with Bing became like this whole thing. And so yeah, so it's great. I'm happy to be like a part of it.
We've been joined this afternoon by Miss Dream Hampton, who's coming to us from Detroit. She is a pioneer of hip hop journalism, though she doesn't do much of it anymore, at least hip hop journalism. Former editor at The Source and a longtime contributor to Vibe magazine from its launch, a product of New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. Her film projects include I Am Ali from 2002 and the Black August Hip Hop Project. And she was chosen by online magazine For Harriet as one of the most inspiring Black women on Twitter. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, Ms. Hampton.
Thank you, Mark Anthony, and thank you for everything that you do. My God, I really enjoyed the Duke conference that you recently did, and your Julie Dash interview was amazing. So just thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you very much.
Okay, peace.
Peace. Good afternoon and welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we're so happy to be joined this afternoon by Professor Elaine Richardson, who's Professor of Literacy Studies in the School of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University. How are you doing today, Elaine?
I'm doing well, feeling mighty blessed.
Professor Richardson is also the author of several books, including African American Literacies, that's 2003 with Routledge, Hip Hop Literacies 2006, that's also Routledge, and she is one of the co-editors of the groundbreaking anthology, Homegirls Make Some Noise, Hip Hop Feminism and Anthology, which was edited with Gwendolyn Pugh, Rachel Ramis, and Aisha Durham. And you're also the curator of Hip Hop Literacies, the Globalization of Black Popular Culture, an interdisciplinary conference. It'll be at Ohio State May 9th through 11th. Talk a little bit about the conference.
Well, this is our second year. The first year, we conceived it really as a local Ohio conference. Yeah. Because I wanted to connect with other people in the state who are doing hip hop education or organizing, working with youth, educators. You know, I just wanted to find artists, everybody in the Ohio area, because you know, I was a new professor here at Ohio State, and just trying to connect to see who else was around that I could collaborate with. Yeah. And the conference actually turned into a national conference because people all over started, you know, sending in proposals, and we had actually put it out locally. So we said, hey, let's go with the flow. So we did find, you know, people in the local area, and also reconnected to people throughout the country. So, you know, yet last year was our first year, and it was kind of rocky, you know, figuring out how to do everything. And that was our trial run, but it still went very well. And this year, we decided to not just, you know, cast a broad net, but to try to be more direct, looking for people who are doing research and outreach about the globalization of hip hop and Black popular culture. So we're trying to reach international as well as national and local scholars.
Marcelina Morgan, who of course directs the hip hop archive at Harvard University, is one of your keynoters. Talk about what kind of expertise Professor Morgan brings to the table in terms of this particular discussion.
Dr. Morgan, as the curator for the Harvard Hip Hop Archive, has connections to a lot of researchers, educators, artists, community workers all over the world who use hip hop. And I mean, she was just the perfect person for us because she can talk about it from such a broad angle about the globalization of hip hop language.
We're here with Professor Elaine Richardson, who is a professor of literacy in the School of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University. She's also the curator of the forthcoming conference, Hip Hop Literacies, the Globalization of Black Popular Culture. You know, hip hop has been in the mainstream for 20 years. You and I have lived with hip hop much longer than that. And still when people hear things like hip hop literacy or hip hop literacies, you know, there's still a bit of a confusion. Talk about the value, and this has been part of your research now for some time, about the role that hip hop plays in terms of developing literacy strategies, you know, in general amongst American youth, but particularly to Black youth in school age settings.
Definitely. Well, you know, my training is in English and applied linguistics, so that is basically the angle that I come to hip hop with is actually valuing and understanding the complexity of the language and literacy skills that students have who have been written off. People who have been called basic writers, non-readers, people who've been said to have restricted language skills. I mean, people like Geneva Smitherman and William Labov, John Ball, so many people debunked that years and years, decades ago, that poor Black kids didn't have language skills, that they didn't have literacy skills. And barring any, cognitive, handicap, these same people that are said to be illiterate are very literate, very much so, and their wealth, their funds of knowledge are not being drawn upon in so many ways. So that's what got me into hip hop studies.
Who else is keynoting at the conference?
Well, we are kicking the conference off with the brother that I like to call my man, Mark Anthony Neal. I mean, we just could not think of a better person to kick the conference off because of your work. You've laid the foundation in so many ways for Black popular culture and all that you've done with the hip hop anthology that you put together. That's, like the standard bearer in our field. So we had to have you. And we also have Ron Jackson, who is a professor of identity studies at the University of Illinois. And he's going to be talking about the globalization of Black male imagery. So we really want to get the community out. That's one of the main reasons that, I've just been so excited and been doing a lot of networking here is because a lot of people don't really understand what hip hop studies is and have bought into so many distorted conversations and uninformed conversations about what hip hop is, what hip hop studies is, and how people are using hip hop not just in education but for political organizing. Right. And a lot of times it comes to us as though people over there are doing this, but over here there's nothing happening except, the foul mouth, scantily clad, commodified hip hop. But there is a lot more that is going on, and I really want people here locally to see that the world is coming to OSU to talk
about hip hop,
to talk about hip hop and the potential that it has for our kids and how people are using it in scholarship and youth organizing. And just today we finalized. I couldn't say beforehand because we didn't have it all the kinks knocked out of the paperwork and the bureaucracy. But our artist, our national artist, who's a keynote speaker and also going to perform, is MC Light. So I'm really
that's great. That's fantastic. And I just want to note real quickly that Professor Jackson had published a really important book a few years ago, Scripting the Black Masculine, which is particularly relevant in the conversations we've been having recently about Black male images and the shooting of Trayvon Martin. So his keynote definitely would be very timely in that regard.
Definitely.
You and we both have, Mark Lamont Hill and a few other folks have contributed to a semester-long series at the University of Wisconsin at Madison under the direction of Gloria Ladson-Billings and our man Willie Nay. And one of the things I recall, when I had the chance to visit Madison earlier this year, Professor Ladson-Billings talked about how she's witnessing herself a generation of scholars who are no longer seeing themselves simply as scholars. And this is my way to segue to the other way that the world knows Professor Elaine Richardson is as Dr. E, jazz singer, gospel singer, R&B singer, show tune singer. Talk a little bit about what it's like trying to balance, being Madam Professor in the classroom, but at the same time the sassy soul mama, on stage and touring around the country.
Oh man, it's a labor of love. I'll say that. It gets a little hectic, but I wouldn't have it any other way. There were so many years when I didn't know, that I could do this.
Yeah.
And I just got, inspired and encouraged by looking at so many other people that are just, writing their own script and inventing their own life.
Yeah.
And, just going with the gifts God gave me. And it's been really beautiful. I love it.
We're here with Professor Elaine Richardson, who's a professor of literacy studies at the School of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University, the author of several books, including African American Literacies and Hip Hop Literacies, and editor of the groundbreaking volume, Homegirls Make Some Noise, Hip Hop Feminism Anthology, and also the curator of the upcoming conference at The Ohio State University, Hip Hop Literacies, the Globalization of Black Popular Culture, an interdisciplinary conference. When you talk about using this kind of part, the piece of your life, the music part, to kind of make a life for yourself, you have this incredible backstory. And of course, you're working and completing a memoir now called From PhD to PhD. Talk a little bit about that transition, talk a little bit about the book, talk about your backstory, because it really is phenomenal. We hear all these stories about folks who are on the come up, and some of it is kind of couched in a way, for mainstream media. We find out about all these rappers, who went to Catholic school and grew up in middle class, communities and all those kinds of things, who create this hood, reality for their backdrop. But for you, this is real talk. Your kind of transformation to become, Professor Elaine Richardson. Talk a little bit about the title From PhD to PhD and that transition.
Yeah, well, the title stands for Poho on Dope to PhD. And I struggled with that title because that was just how it came to me.
Yeah.
And I talked to a lot of people, and I wrote and rewrote and revised and talked and thought, and so many people have said, keep that title, because that title represents where I come from and the people that I feel will read that book and feel encouraged, because sometimes you get trapped up in a lifestyle and you don't really know that you can get out. Yeah. You don't, I know I didn't know I could get out. And so I wrote that book for people who come from places like I came from. I remember coming to Cleveland State University after graduating from East Tech, didn't know what I wanted to major in, coming straight from the streets, having had a baby, being in a battered women's shelter because the guy who I was with had become very abusive. And, I just had a lot of issues with getting out of prostitution and getting off drugs and trying to make a life for myself. And I remember going to Cleveland State University and not knowing where I fit in, not having that confidence, feeling like everybody knew that I was a hoe, that, wasn't that girl that used to be on Prospect, or, she looks familiar. So anytime somebody looked at me, even though they probably didn't know, but it's just me feeling like, because I had been so much out there in my own city, I went around the country, but I also did a lot of my stuff like right in my hood and right downtown. And so a lot of people did know about me. And I just felt like everybody had something to say about me, and I didn't feel like I fit in. And so eventually I was academically dismissed from Cleveland State because I didn't feel like I fit in. And so that, not just that person who might be out there that feels like they can't go to college, they can't change their life. And it might not just be college, but, when you feel a certain way about yourself, it doesn't matter what other people say. But I just want to let people know that you can create a different life for yourself. So I tried to be as honest as I possibly could. I mean, of course, I couldn't tell everything. It's like incidents in the life of a slave girl. It's the update on that. But I did tell a lot. And I finally got a publisher. I just got a publisher for the book, so I'm feeling really blessed and happy about that. And it's a guy who really understands me and wants me to tell my story and doesn't want to make it an academic, stereotypical academic autoethnography. It's like, this is the straight, dope truth of my life.
Yeah. And we'll look forward to having you back on Left to Black to talk about the book, when it comes out soon. We've been joined this afternoon by Professor Elaine Richardson, who's a professor of literacy studies in the School of Teaching and Learning at The Ohio State University. She's the author of several books and also the editor of the groundbreaking volume, Homegirl Makes Some Noise, the Hip Hop Feminism Anthology. And she's a curator of the forthcoming conference, Hip Hop Literacies, the Globalization of Black Popular Culture, which will be held at The Ohio State University May 9th through 11th. Thanks for joining us today, Professor Richardson.
Thank you, brother.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.